Hi, and welcome to Tinnitus Awareness Week 2026. My name is Patrick Lynch, the CEO of the American Tinnitus Association. We're so glad you're tuning in for this event, and we're thrilled to be talking today, and I'll bring them here on the screen, with Dr. Susan Shore and Jon Pearson, both leaders in their field, and they're joining us today to talk about a very interesting topic overall with tinnitus and an exciting product that they've been working on together for a long time. But more exciting to me as the CEO of the American Tinnitus Association is the impact to us as patients, as a tinnitus sufferer myself. All of the news about any potential treatments and research is of the utmost importance to the ATA. And so in an effort to make that possible, we're thrilled to have experts in the field. Susan and Jon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Patrick. It's great to see you again, and we really appreciate the opportunity to speak to people globally that suffer from tinnitus. Thank you.
Thank you guys, and thank you for the time. And I know this will go, this means a lot to a lot of people. And Susan, it's so great to see you. We had the opportunity to finally meet a couple of months ago before the holidays. And even before meeting you, I'd heard so many incredible things. And so as a new-ish leader to the ATA, it was a real honor to finally get to connect with you. And when we were talking, just your history in the field was so fascinating to hear about. I don't know if you'd be willing to share with the audience a little bit about your background. Perhaps you can share with us back to when you first became interested in tinnitus at all as a research focus of yours. What sparked tinnitus for you in that initial curiosity?
Mhm. Thank you very much for having us. We're really delighted to have this opportunity to share both the history of my career and the development of the device and the company Auricle. So your first question is, how did I get involved in the tinnitus field? I haven't always been a tinnitus researcher, and for many years, my work at the University of Michigan was focusing on multisensory integration in the brain, and in particular, a specific region of the brain called the cochlear nucleus, which is the region of the brain that directly connects with the cochlea, with the nerves from the ear. And so at the time, my work was focusing on demonstrating that there were connections not only from the cochlea, the auditory system, but also from the somatosensory system. That's nerves that innervate the face and the neck and the shoulders. And we had shown that these centers from the neck and face, conveying touch sensation, entered into the cochlear nucleus. So we had described the anatomical connections, we described the neurotransmitters that these connections use, and then we started to look at whether these connections were functional. And around this time, in the mid-2000s, there was a researcher, and not the only one, but the first one to my knowledge, who showed that people who had tinnitus were able to modulate their tinnitus by maneuvers of the head and neck. So, for example, they could clench their jaw, or they could raise their eyebrows, or blow out their cheeks, and this would change both the pitch and the intensity of their tinnitus. And so this got me interested in tinnitus because we were showing these connections from the somatosensory system, which would be activated when people did these maneuvers. And so that is really what first got me interested in studying tinnitus in relationship to multisensory integration.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so fascinating. And forgive my layman's questions and perspective here as the patient advocate. I'm a recovering attorney, but not a recovering PhD. So I appreciate your patience with my angle here. Bimodal neuromodulation is a term I had to learn very quickly when I joined the ATA. My understanding, and maybe you could even help define it for the audience that may not know what bimodal neuromodulation is, but it wasn't always the promising approach that it seems like it is today. From your point of view, what were some of those early challenges and maybe even the skepticism that you faced when you were pursuing bimodal?
Yes, I'm going to change your view of this completely, Patrick, because there was not bimodal stimulation when we started our work. No one was doing bimodal stimulation. And I think you're going to ask me at some point, you said earlier that you would ask me to detail my work and how it evolved. I would like to show a slide that will show you how we developed this treatment and then why we ended up calling it bimodal.
That'd be
So
great.
the term bimodal really means just two modes. And anything in the world can be bimodal. It just means two different modes, two different things that are happening. In the case of our treatment, it's stemmed directly from the work that we were doing with the animals, and directly from what I told you before, in that we had shown that somatosensory connections went into the cochlear nucleus. And then later in our studies, we showed that stimulating these two senses could produce a kind of plasticity in the cochlear nucleus that was long-term. And we utilized this plasticity to develop the treatment. And because we were stimulating two senses, we called it bimodal stimulation. Then after we started publishing on this and showing our work, then other people started to use this term for different kinds of treatments. And so later on in our later studies, we actually modified what we called this, and we called it bisensory treatment, because it's still bimodal, but more specifically, it's two senses that we're stimulating. And we have to stimulate both of these senses in order to get this long-term plasticity that ends up being a treatment for tinnitus. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. Thank you for walking us through that. And so we know now, especially after some recent research, that it is much more promising than it may have even been earlier on. I would argue it's a potential serious breakthrough, if it isn't already, for treatment for patients, this concept. When you're looking back at your years when you were active in Michigan, can you think of a discovery or a breakthrough moment that stands out over the course of your career as like the most pivotal in terms of how we understand how tinnitus works in the brain?
Yeah, I can share some slides with you. And there wasn't really one pivotal moment. There were several of them, and they catapulted each other. And so I'll share a little bit with you. And please ask me these questions so that I can bring it down to a non-scientist point of view.
I can absolutely
It's really
bring the
hard
ignorant
for us
question.
scientists to do that.
Thank you.
So let me see if I can do this. Okay. What I have here is, can you see this arrow, by the way, when I use
Yes, we
arrow?
got you. Thank
So
you.
this is a cross-section of the dorsal cochlear nucleus. This is the place where it all happens. This is the structure in the nervous system where the correlates of tinnitus, or where tinnitus signals first begin in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. And this dorsal cochlear nucleus then projects up to the rest of the brain. So everything that's processed here in the dorsal cochlear nucleus ends up going to the rest of the brain. So what we did was we recorded from these fusiform cells in the cochlear nucleus. And what we wanted to record from these cells was SFR here, spontaneous firing rate. And you may ask, why spontaneous firing rate? Because tinnitus is a sound that's generated by the brain, in fact, by these neurons at first in the nervous system. And because tinnitus is in silence, we want to record the neuron's activity in silence. And so that's what I'm going to show you here. So we took there's some control guinea pigs. We recorded from their dorsal cochlear nuclei, and we plotted their spontaneous firing rate. And we plotted them across this axis of the cochlear nucleus, which is tonotopic. So we're plotting this according to the best frequencies of those neurons. Now we noise exposed animals, and this is the noise exposure spectrum. So it's centered at about 7 kilohertz. And we noise exposed these animals for an hour at around 100 decibels. And then we waited for 10 days or so. And then it's 8 weeks post exposure. And then we recorded from these animals, the ones that had been noise exposed. And we divided these animals into two groups, those that got tinnitus and those that did not have tinnitus. And you can see the ones that don't have tinnitus have exactly the same spontaneous firing rates as the normal animals. But when we look at the tinnitus animals, you can see that the spontaneous firing rates are greatly elevated. And they're elevated in a frequency-specific manner that's related to the noise exposure frequency. So this was a very pivotal finding. There had been other researchers, and we showed this multiple times in our lab too, that animals with tinnitus had increased spontaneous rates. But I think the very important finding here is that you had to divide the animals into tinnitus and no tinnitus animals to clearly see that it's only the animals that got tinnitus that showed this increased spontaneous firing rate. So it's not just because of the noise exposure, but it's because of the tinnitus factor. And these animals that don't develop tinnitus have some sort of protective factor where they don't get this increased spontaneous firing rate. So then we went on and we also looked at how the neurons synchronize with each other, which is an important correlate for perception. And we showed the same thing, that animals with tinnitus had increased synchrony between them. And this had not been shown ever before in the cochlear nucleus, or in fact, very well in other structures. So this was also a very important finding. So we showed that fusiform cells in tinnitus animals show increased cross-unit synchrony or increased synchrony between each other. Now, the other thing that I wanted to tell you about, and this is important, is because we did a noise exposure that damaged the animal's cochlears just a little bit. And there's a lot of reasons why we only wanted a mild exposure that we can get into later. But this is showing here the ribbons per inner hair cell. This is actually the synapses, the cochlear synapses within the cochlea. And we can show here that the animals that got exposed, the left ears, there's a small decrease, a small but significant decrease along the length of the cochlea, especially for the higher frequencies, compared to the control animals. But when we break this down into the animals that got tinnitus versus the animals that didn't get tinnitus, there's no difference between them. And this was a very important finding as well, because this shows that tinnitus does not emerge in the cochlea. And the cochlear nucleus is the first place where we see neurons that are coding specifically for tinnitus. And I emphasize this as well because it's very important in studies to distinguish between animals that get tinnitus and those that don't get tinnitus, and not just between animals that get exposure and non-exposure. Because just like people, not all animals that are noise exposed will get tinnitus. So there's something specific happening in their brains.
This sounds like a very core distinction that you're making there.
Absolutely.
And that's something that was a preconceived notion prior to this, that there was my understanding is in the history of tinnitus, there was a point where we did think it did start in the cochlea, and what you're showing here is it's beyond that, or what
right. And this is, yes, this is many other studies show this in different ways as well. That tinnitus originates in the brain. So now what I'm showing you is getting to the crux of how we came up with modal stimulation. And this part is a little bit difficult to explain to non-scientists, so please interrupt me or at the end of it ask me a question. What I'm showing here is what we call a plasticity curve. And what we were able to do with these neurons in the cochlear nucleus, we were able to induce long-term plasticity into these neurons. And long-term plasticity can be divided into long-term potentiation, and I'll explain that in a minute, or long-term depression. So what we're showing here is the change in firing rate after we've stimulated the animals with a bimodal stimulus. And bimodal stimulus in this case is auditory plus somatosensory. And we can stimulate the somatosensory system either with deep brain stimulation or transcutaneously on the neck, for example. So here's a line, a zero line, that's zero plasticity. But if we've stimulated the neuron so that it's producing increased firing rate, and this is increased for long term, say it lasts for about an hour after we've done the stimulation, this is called long-term potentiation. But if when we stimulate it, there's a depression in the firing rate, this is called long-term depression. And when we play these different stimuli with different bimodal intervals, so in this case here, -20, means that the sound became, before the electrical somatosensory stimulus, 20 milliseconds. So the sound preceded the electrical stimulus by 20 milliseconds. And here it's by 10 milliseconds, and here they're simultaneous. And here the order has switched. So now the somatosensory stimulation is coming 10 milliseconds before, and now it's coming 20 milliseconds before. So now we present these different sounds and we induce this plasticity. And so now if we look at the white curve, which is the normal animal, we can see that, for example, at -10, we're causing long-term potentiation. So the firing rate is increased long-term for at least an hour. This is called long-term potentiation. But when we look at this interval here, which is the order is switched and it's 5 milliseconds between them, we see long-term depression. And so we can plot these out and we get a plasticity curve. So now if you look at the normal animals, this is what the plasticity curve looks like. Now we noise expose the animals, and for the exact same stimuli, these animals are showing different plasticity curves. So for example, the no tinnitus animals are showing much less plasticity. So they have some protective factor that's preventing them from showing this plasticity. Whereas the animals that get tinnitus are showing much more long-term potentiation than they are long-term depression. And that means that these neurons have become hyperexcitable in the animals that have tinnitus. So do you have any questions that need clarification of what I've just told you?
No specific questions just yet. It's fascinating to hear this explained from someone who's done the research directly. I appreciate that. I think the term is something that I've been exposed to as a patient for a couple of years, and I've read the studies as best I can, but to see the data here on the screen is very helpful.
Okay, so this is now leading to the definition of our bimodal stimulation. And so where I'm going to take you, and I'll get back to this later on when we talk a little bit more about the treatment, but you can see here that if we stimulate at this interval in animals that have been noise exposed, and we do it over and over again, we could make this tinnitus even worse because we could make these cells more excitable. But if we stimulated them over here, where we're producing long-term depression, and we did this over and over again, we're going to decrease the excitability of these cells. And we've shown that this excitability of these cells is linked directly to the spontaneous rate that I showed you in the previous slide. So when we do this, we can decrease those spontaneous rates. And then we also showed we can decrease the tinnitus in those animals. And so this is what led to bimodal stimulation, this long-term plasticity.
Absolutely fascinating, and appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this at the quote unquote 101 level, which is certainly where I am medically speaking. I noticed on one of your slides, some of this research dates back to 2008, and that is, I believe, shortly thereafter, around the time when you yourself got involved with the American Tinnitus Association, who we're with here today. You've had a remarkable relationship with ATA that I've heard about, but I'd love to hear you share a little bit about it if you could, because I believe some of this overlaps what you were just sharing. My understanding is you're not only just a grant recipient from the ATA, but you've served on our board, you've served as the chair of our board, you've served in a voluntary capacity on our scientific advisory committee, and you even testified before Congress on your research and the importance of federal funding for tinnitus research. This is a selfish question as the CEO of the ATA, but I'd love to hear what brought you to the ATA in the first place, and what were those years like, and what did that grant funding from the ATA mean, if anything?
Yes, I came to the ATA for funding, like everybody else does. And I was a much younger researcher then, as we all were younger back then. And I had not yet received my first grant. So I had just finished my postdoc, and I started in on this somatosensory research. And I just learned of the link between the somatosensory system, and the auditory system. And so I wrote a grant to the ATA to look at the relationship between the auditory somatosensory connections and tinnitus. And so that was the very first grant that I received to study this phenomenon.
Wow. And that's inspiring for me to hear as a donor to the ATA, that some of that funding can go to research that has an impact on research that turns into some of the incredible information you were just sharing with us now. And in your time serving as a volunteer for the ATA on the board, and certainly as a scientific advisory committee, could you speak a little bit about what you saw from the ATA and why organizations like the American Tinnitus Association are important for work like yours?
The ATA recruits scientists to be on their scientific advisory board. And usually it's people who have made some impact already. So they're considered experts in one or another topic that relates to tinnitus. And so I was recruited to the scientific advisory board which involved reviewing many grants and helping the ATA to choose which grants they would fund. And that was a great learning experience for me to do that, because I learned how better to review grants, how to interact with my colleagues who were also interested in the same area. And then at some point after I'd done that for a number of years, then I was elected to be the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board. And that is an election. So it's not like I asked to be it, but I accepted the role. And then that got me more into leadership positions. And then I was also asked by ATA, who was also very involved in advocating for tinnitus patients. And they were the ones who asked me to go to Congress. And so I took that trip to Congress, which was very exciting to advocate. And I think it resulted in increased funding for the VA for tinnitus. So that was, that was really worth all the work to see that happen.
I'm so happy to hear that. And thank you on behalf of the 50 million plus Americans who we try to represent. You've had a real impact, and it's clear just looking through your research and hearing it directly from you. So thank you for sharing that, which leads to my next question. And Jon, your relationship with Jon, this at some point, what you were discovering and what you saw here led to your decision to translate your laboratory findings into what today is called Auricle. Maybe, Jon, it's a better question for you to answer. Can you tell us about your background and how you got involved with Susan and how this research turned into this thing that today is called Auricle?
Yeah, Patrick, I would be most happy to do that. First of all, by way of background, I'm Jon Pearson, and I have spent my entire 30-year career in medical devices. And uniquely, I have experience with both professional devices that are sold to physicians as well as home use devices that are sold to consumers. And Auricle is actually my second venture-backed med device startup as co-founder. So I have experience with private corporations, public corporations, as well as now 2 venture-backed med device companies. I would say that the idea for Auricle really started back in 2019, and that is when I discovered the appeal of what I call the university IP model as a launchpad for startups. And what I mean by that is most venture-backed startups are formed around a single risky idea. And university innovation, in contrast, is quite different because researchers like Susan will apply for what are called non-dilutive sources of funding. Most of those come from the federal government. I think in 2023, as an example, the federal government provided just over $60 billion to leading US research universities for professors, scientists to perform research. And using those funds, the best ideas tend to percolate up through a rigorous peer-reviewed process. And then offices of innovation partnership, or what's also called the offices of technology transfer, will provide intellectual property protection to the ideas that they deem are best. And then they will try to license that IP to companies. And so I think it is a smarter, lower risk way to building a successful company. And that applies whether you are the inventor like Susan, or the entrepreneur like myself, or the people that invest in the company so that it can make progress and go forward. And I also think that what I would call the skills and experience match is equally compelling, because I realize that I certainly have no background in science and research, but I do have relevant commercialization experience in medical devices. So I could then pair that with the scientific expertise of people like Susan. So it was in, I believe it was April of 2019 that I made an appointment with the director of the Office of Tech Transfer at the University of Michigan, thinking that there might be some interesting ideas that I might be able to become involved with. And when he saw my background specifically in consumer medical devices, that's when he said, "Hey, I have a researcher that I think you absolutely should meet with." And that was when he introduced me to Susan and also David Martell, who at that time was at the Shore Lab. I think that as we're discovering today and listening to Susan's comments, she's certainly an incredibly accomplished person in so many different ways. But I think one of the things that really stood out to me in my initial meetings with her was what I would call her relentless focus and drive, because she had spent at that time even about 20 years researching tinnitus. And the work that she had done had sparked over 7,000 emails from people suffering from the condition globally that were really desperate for a cause. And so I think, Patrick, that it was really two things. It was her passion and the obvious market need that kind of crystallized my decision to want to become a part of bringing this therapy to the market to the people who desperately need it. I tried to come up with a single slide or an image that sort of captures or encapsulates all the work that Susan's done. If you have that handy and can pull it up, I think it might be helpful. They often say that a picture is maybe worth 1,000 words. And so, what I try to show in this single image is the arc and the breadth of Susan's research. And it's really, I think, pretty compelling because Susan started out not trying to identify a cure for tinnitus, but she really started out trying to identify its source. Where in the auditory pathway does it emanate from? And then she focused on a therapy to treat it. So I think what I really respected about her approach was what is outlined here, in that there was a significant period of basic science, which focused on discovery, and then that work was developed into research in an animal model using guinea pigs, which we just learned a little bit more about technically. And then once she had validated that work in an animal model, she started the translational work to humans with her first pilot study in 2018, and then later confirmatory study in 2023. So again, I think this was personally very impressive to me. But I also think that it's really validating in terms of her approach to developing and understanding this therapy, and the fact that anyone can really critique it, understand it, and look at it. Because through the course of this research, I think at last count, Susan has 34 peer reviewed publications just within this area. That doesn't capture all of the research that she's done, because she probably has close to 100 publications perhaps in total. Just that focus in tinnitus, I think, is really impressive. And I think the last comment I'll make is that through those meetings with Susan and David and an examination of her work, I really became convinced that, as we say here in California, her therapy had both a technical and clinical right to succeed. So I think that's why, as an entrepreneur, I got really excited about it.
I like that. A right to succeed. There is so much excitement and anticipation around this potential device. Susan, it's got to be thrilling to see the hundreds of papers of research that Jon was just alluding to, and to see that this thing coming to formation out of it. I know the tinnitus community is excited about it as well. If you had to sum it up, Susan, what is it that you would want the tinnitus community to know about the device, and what the research shows it can, and maybe even more importantly, cannot do?
I think the first thing you can take from Jon's slide, and if you look at that timeline, I think the first thing that people need to understand is how long it takes if you're going to do something right. And doing something right means not taking the shortcuts. It means going into depth to try to understand the mechanisms before you ever get to being able to do anything like a treatment. And so I think that is something that even scientists don't really understand, how long it takes first to discover something, and then how long it takes to get IP, and then how long it takes to do clinical trials, and then how long it takes to commercialize. So it's a very lengthy process. And I know that many people are very frustrated by that, but you can multiply their frustration by 10 to come to my frustration and Jon's too, I think. We would like to just give this to people like right away, but then you learn that you can't just do that. You've got to go through all of these steps.
It's funny you use the word frustration. It's certainly, that's innate to tinnitus in and of itself, is this frustration, and that we all suffer from, myself included. And your point is so valid, which is we all want to get the best thing out as quickly as possible. But at the same time, if something needs to be done correctly, I would imagine it takes, to your point, it does take time to get it there.
Okay. So to this other part of your question is that what does it do and what does it not do?
Yes.
I didn't bring slides to show you the results of the clinical trials, but people can go and look those up. But essentially what we showed was in a double-blinded randomized trial, placebo-controlled randomized trial, was that in the first study we showed that after 4 weeks of the treatment, we saw a progressive decline in the patient's tinnitus loudness as well as their TFI scores. And that was for 4 weeks. And then we decided to do a longer study and with more people. And that was the second study where we increased the length to 6 weeks. And we showed that we got an even better result. And that in fact, even after we stopped the treatment after 6 weeks, we continued to get a decline in the tinnitus loudness and in the TFI. And so it was a very good result. And we looked at clinically significant results as well. So we showed that over 60% of people in the study showed a clinically significant reduction in their TFI scores. And which means that there were even more people that showed a reduction in their tinnitus loudness and TFI that didn't necessarily reach clinical significance. But with a longer period of time, probably there would be even more who showed that. So that is a very good result for a trial that is very well controlled with a placebo. And that is very important because, especially with tinnitus, there is a massive placebo effect. You pretty much can just tell somebody that something's going to work and their tinnitus gets better, at least for a little period of time. So it was absolutely essential to have a placebo control. And so I think that's, again, the rigor is what makes the results more reliable. And again, it's choosing the approach that's not a shortcut and not an easy way, but a hard way. And that's, if I want to encourage people going forward with other studies, is that is to be rigorous and not to take shortcuts. So what does it not do? It doesn't treat hyperacusis, for example. Many people have said, does this also affect hyperacusis? And no, it was developed very specifically from the basic science, looking at the underlying mechanism of tinnitus. And even though there is some overlap in the people who get tinnitus, tend to get hyperacusis and the other way around, but that doesn't mean that the mechanisms are identical. And in fact, I don't think the mechanisms are identical. I think even it's a different group of cells in the brain that produces hyperacusis than produces tinnitus. No, it's specifically tailored to address tinnitus, and that's what it's being developed to do.
Thank you. And the idea for the layperson, the idea that a study has or tries to address a placebo effect in something like tinnitus is indeed, from the little I've been able to gather, quite a time-intensive and resource-intensive process, which again is why organizations like the ATA exist, to try and help fund research like this and educate patients on where we're at and where we're going. Jon, I have a question about all of this from a business perspective. We're hearing about how long it takes, how difficult it is to bring into practice, the work and the rigorous study that needs to go behind it. From a business perspective, from your angle, what's been the biggest challenge so far actually bringing something like this to the market?
Yeah, great question, Patrick. And I think from my personal experience, the biggest challenge has really been taking a therapy that has 2 human studies behind it in 2018 and 2023, where, it seems that we've answered the quote unquote hard questions already. Specifically, is the device safe? Does it have a low adverse event profile, for example? And does the device work? That's what everyone wants to know. And I think that both of those studies, in the way that Susan explained, really did demonstrate compelling safety and efficacy. So, from the entrepreneur's perspective, it's wow, this is fantastic. We've answered the difficult questions already. We have a very inherently simple device in terms of the architecture, the way it's used. How hard can it be to bring this through a regulatory process and then into market? And I think that being very candid, that has been the biggest challenge area for me because despite the 30 years of experience that I have within medical devices, even I didn't understand the intricacies and the challenge of taking what is effectively a university developed innovation and then developing that into a product that is not only appropriate for the real world, but also something that can get through a major regulatory submission, whether that's the CE mark or whether that's the FDA. I think that difference has been the biggest challenge. And I think to highlight and illustrate this point a little bit better, I have a couple of slides that maybe are helpful to pull up just so we can take a look at that. So thank you. What this slide shows is really what was used in both the 2018 and the 2023 human studies. And many people that are familiar with Susan's work may recognize the image on the far left because that is what we call the take-home treatment device. This is a system that is handheld, it's battery operated, it has a single auditory stimulus and then two electrodes. A very simple device. But then what I realized was that in order to provide the customized treatment file on that device, we have what's called an audiologist interface, which is represented by some hardware that the healthcare professional, in our case, the audiologist or the ENT physician, would be using to be able to program the device for the person with tinnitus. And then also as part of that, we require a Windows-based PC that has two proprietary software programs that are used in the programming of the device for each patient. What started out as what appears to be a very simple device on the left-hand side actually has quite a bit more complexity behind it. And so this also has implications not only for the hardware, because from the FDA's point of view, everything that you see in front of you is our end-to-end medical device, but also we have two, what the FDA would call designated users of this system. There is, of course, the person with tinnitus that uses the take-home device, and then the audiologist, who is a healthcare professional that prescribes and provides the device to the patient. And although this system that we're looking at was perfect for university research and we were able to show safety and efficacy with it, I think that if you examine the individual portions, you can see that it certainly appears more prototypical than something that is a finished product that might be available for market, for example. This is what we started with, and then we realized that although we could show safety and efficacy with this, it wasn't really optimized either for what we would call real world users, or it was not optimized for a major regulatory submission. And to kind of understand maybe what's the difference between a research prototype versus a device that is ready for a major regulatory submission. If you could maybe go to the next slide, I think that this illustrates that a little bit better. I won't review every single aspect that I'm showing here, but essentially what this chart tries to show at a high level are 6 different aspects, ranging from the purpose of a device to hardware, software, what it takes for regulatory compliance or those considerations. And the research prototype column, that's really the type of device that we just looked at. It was what was used in our 2 human studies. And clearly, from these 6 different aspects, everything about that system was really built towards gaining early understanding to test and learn. And so, whether it's the hardware or whether it's the software, it is not developed with kind of the real world or a regulatory submission in mind. Whereas if you're designing something that goes into a major regulatory submission, it really is a significantly higher hurdle in terms of all of the requirements for that. And if you look at the last row, regulatory compliance, if you're designing something to be used in university research, you're not really thinking too much about regulatory compliance and requirements because that's something that is not usually applicable to the research that you're doing. Whereas if you are trying to receive an FDA clearance for a system, then that implies that the device meets all of the relevant international and US standards for device development. There are many of these. There's ISO 14971, which talks about what's called risk assessment. There are the electrical safety and essential performance testing requirements that are captured in what's called IEC 60601. And if your device has software in it, there is a whole set of guidelines that mandate how that software needs to be developed and then validated and verified. When we examined the device that was used and was shown on the previous slide, we really realized that while that was perfect for the intended research at the time, it wasn't really ready for a major submission. So then that's what got us focused on developing a device that would satisfy those requirements, and that's captured on the next slide. And what this slide shows, and what we're quite excited about, is all of the progress that we have been able to make in developing a device that uses the exact same electrical and acoustic stimulation protocol, because that's really what we consider to be the most important feature of the device, is what I would call a delivery system for that therapy. So we're using the exact same protocol that Susan developed in her research, but we now have a much simpler system. We have a single box that serves as both the take-home treatment device as well as the device that is used in programming at the audiologist's office. We have improved the software so that it meets all the requirements and standards for a medical device submission, while also improving the graphical user interface. And of course, the entire system that you see has been designed and developed to meet all of the standards that are appropriate for this level of device. So I think in summary, these slides illustrate not only the biggest challenge that I discovered, but also how we're thinking about it and the solution that we are working towards.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. We've all heard whispers and rumors and ideas and thoughts about where you guys are, and it's inspiring to hear from you both directly about this. And you said a couple of things that caught my attention, Jon, when you were, it was funny. I couldn't help but think of the analogy between this device and tinnitus itself, which is we started off thinking one thing and then we realized how much more complex it is. And now we're at a much more complex version. It mirrors tinnitus research itself. But when you were looking at how complex the device was becoming earlier on, a couple of years ago, and even now the device as it is on that last slide we just saw, let's see if I can pull it back up. There it is. How, let's say we're in the future. Maybe you can even address when you think we might get through our friends at the government who are looking out for our best interests, of course, but it does take time. Let's pretend we're there. We're over the regulatory hurdles. How do I, as a patient, get to a device like this? Would I have to see an audiologist, an ENT, some other type of specialist? What do either of you anticipate the patient access looking like?
Yeah, great question. In terms of the initial regulatory clearance that we are anticipating, Patrick, it would be as a physician prescribed home use device. And so what that simply means is, in order for a person with tinnitus to be able to obtain the device, they would need to visit a healthcare professional. And in our case, it's very reasonable and logical that professional would either be an audiologist or an ENT physician that is treating tinnitus patients. Step one is visiting a healthcare professional that is able to fit and prescribe the device to the person with tinnitus. And then once that fitment process is completed, then the person with tinnitus takes the device home to use for home treatments. So that's the initial anticipated clearance pathway. I think in the future, very similar to hearing aids. Hearing aids were originally only available through a healthcare professional like an audiologist. But then in 2017, Congress passed what is called the Direct to Consumer Hearing Aid Act. And that act essentially allowed companies to provide hearing aids to patients direct to consumer. So many people are probably familiar with the many companies that have sprouted up as new ones, as well as devices from the established hearing healthcare companies, where you can effectively go online and go through a limited testing procedure to be quote unquote fit for a hearing aid, which is then sent and sold directly to you. So I think in the future, that's also the technology pathway and regulatory clearance pathway that we envision.
That makes total sense. Thanks for sharing that. And you mentioned our friends with hearing aids, and that act from Congress was really transformational in one area, which I know a lot of the folks watching might be concerned about, which is affordability. Is that something that you guys are even a concern for yours yet, or it's too soon to say affordability will or will not be a part of where you guys are headed?
Yeah, I think affordability has been first and foremost in my mind since the beginning, because clearly the total global addressable market opportunity is huge by any metric. But I think for us, and I think I don't mean to speak for Susan, but I think, Susan, you also agree that you want your therapy to be available to the people that desperately need it. And that really shouldn't feature a huge economic barrier in order to be able to do that. In fact, I think you would like the opposite,
Mhm.
as would I think, fortunately, Patrick, from what's called a cost of goods point of view, and that means the bill of material, the different parts that go into the system, the warranty reserve, the packaging, the third party logistics, all of the things that impact the price of a device. We're fortunate in that the cost of this system is comparatively low. And so what that implies is we don't have a system that has an inherently high cost of goods sold that then drives a very high marketplace. So I think we have a lot of opportunity in that regard. But I also want to explain and caution that it's not just the manufacturer of a device that determines what the end user price is. A big part of that is impacted by the channel of distribution or the way in which the product ultimately makes it to the consumer. And in our case, since the audiologist or the ENT treating persons with tinnitus would be the one that would be prescribing the system, it also means that they would be selling the system to the patient. In other words, Auricle would be selling devices to an audiologist who would then in turn sell the device to the patient. And so you have to take into consideration what is the audiologist's requirement in terms of profit expectation. And a lot of that is driven by the amount of time that they are spending with the patient. And with a person with tinnitus, my understanding is there's a significant amount of time, both with not only the setup of the device, but most importantly, post fitment, in terms of ensuring that the device is actually working for the patient, talking through and working through issues that the patient might be experiencing. And all of that time has an impact on end user price. But I think that we very much want this to be an affordable therapy. And especially when you look at the landscape of insurance reimbursement, at least in the United States, there aren't really any current procedural terminology technology points that are available for persons with tinnitus. So what that means is it really becomes an out-of-pocket expense.
Mm.
And so in recognition of that, I think it's very important for us that we try to work with audiologists to make sure that we're pricing it at a level that a majority of people can get into.
I want to be respectful of all of our time because we're coming up on an hour, and I have so many other questions. But if you each would allow me maybe two more, and Susan, as I'm listening to Jon, I'm just thinking about your work before this and the term we started off talking about, which was this bimodal neuromodulation concept. There are other devices that are either in development or some are even on the market already. What is it about Auricle that is unique to some of the devices that we see on the market now or are in development in conjunction with yours?
As I tried to explain at the beginning of the questions, by showing you how we developed our bimodal stimulation, that it was based specifically on the auditory somatosensory integrations in the brain that were responsible for producing the tinnitus. And anybody can develop anything called bimodal. I'm just going to repeat what I said earlier. It doesn't mean anything. What is meaningful is the specific stimulation paradigm that whatever devices are using. And our stimulation paradigm comes directly from the science. In fact, I can show you a slide here. Let me share my screen again. So I've showed you that we developed these plasticity curves based on our recordings. And the previous slide that I showed you, we were using deep brain stimulation. But then we decided that in order for this to be relevant for people, we needed to use something where we were stimulating on the skin. So this is transdermal stimulation. And when we use transdermal stimulation on the neck combined with sound in the guinea pigs, we were able to produce the identical plasticity curves that we had shown with deep brain stimulation. So again, here we're showing the plasticity that we can generate using these different bimodal stimuli. And again, when we noise-exposed animals and the ones that developed tinnitus, we measured again, and they showed the identical curves that we had shown with deep brain stimulation. So these plasticity curves are what determined our stimulus protocol of bimodal stimulation. And like I had alluded to earlier, if we wanted to decrease the hyperactivity or the hyperexcitability of the circuit, we needed to use a stimulus that was going to cause long-term depression. And so we would use this particular stimulus here, which in this case, as we're shown in this curve, it's a little bit less than 10 milliseconds between the auditory and the somatosensory stimulation. And in this case, the sound comes before the stimulus, the electrical stimulus. So the stimulus protocol of the bimodal stimulation is determined exactly from the science. And we have recently called our stimulation bisensory stimulation because we're stimulating the somatosensory system, in this case, the neck, or it could be the face, and we're coupling it with auditory stimulation, sound in the ear. So I'll stop sharing now. I wanted to make those points that this is a specific therapy that's developed from the underlying science. And what you call it is not as important as what it does. And so in our case, this is auditory and somatosensory stimulation that is presented in a specific stimulus protocol that we've shown in the animals with recordings from the neurons, produces long-term depression and also reduces tinnitus in the animals. So this exact stimulus protocol was then transferred to the humans, and the clinical trials were done with the exact stimulus protocol. So I think that is the uniqueness of our treatment compared to other treatments that are currently on the market. And I emphasize that it's really important that your treatments are grounded in scientific research.
You're touching on something, Susan, that I think might be a good way to help us close the conversation. From my angle, representing the American Tinnitus Association, we have been in existence now for 55 years, where we'll be releasing this conversation during Tinnitus Awareness Week. So as I'm talking, Tinnitus Awareness Week is happening, where we're trying to talk about all sorts of topics. Today, it happens to be about your work and you and Auricle and to your point, some may call it bimodal neuromodulation, some may use other terms. But the ATA certainly exists to try to help share information as readily as possible. And sometimes part of that is helping to maybe either set expectations or not overpromise to the community that is desperate for something new, something different than what hasn't worked for them up until this point. From my angle, or from our angle as a public charity that's trying to push all of the information forward, including yours, this is for either of you, Jon or Susan, what would you want a nonprofit like the ATA or others, our friends, our sisters and brothers in this fight, what would you want us, the charities, to emphasize when we are talking about either bimodal neuromodulation or any device in particular? What should we be sharing with the community?
From my point of view, I think that there are certain rules, you might say, about how development of a treatment should happen. And from my point of view, is that the treatment has to be developed from basic science. I think trial and error in humans is never really going to go anywhere. And I know a lot of people will just say, oh, we'll try this and we'll try that. And they get one result and then they try something else and they get another result. But I think whether it works or not, you have to do the experimentation the hard way and the long way to go through the scientific rigor, and so that your treatment is based on science, that it's not based on a trial and error in humans. And so I strongly believe that basic science should precede clinical work, or that at least if you're a clinical researcher, that your clinical research is based on some solid science that you're building on. So I would say from ATA or any other charity point of view is that their grant review process has to be rigorous. And that's a lot of work for the people who are volunteering their time, but that's how it has to go.
And certainly you've literally done that, and your actions have spoken as loud as your words, having volunteered so many generous years to the ATA. And one of the things we're trying to do with Tinnitus Awareness Week today and moving forward is look ahead. So we do, while setting expectations and trying to establish solid, rigorous, evidence-based, peer-reviewed science, we also want to provide hope because it is out there. I think the future does look bright, but it requires organizations like the ATA and others to not only raise funding, but then properly identify where that funding should go. And you've lived every angle of that as a volunteer, a donor, a board member, and a recipient of our research. It's my hope that we continue to fund breakthroughs over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And it's funny because in my personal life, I'm a 3-time cancer survivor. I had it twice as a teenager where I developed my tinnitus. And most recently last year, I went through a battle with colon cancer. And at no point has my cancer been quote unquote cured. I'm here 25, 30, 35 years later, still telling stories about when I was 15 and had all these chemotherapies and radiation. Treatments have evolved. So research in cancer has not cured cancer. But boy, if I had today what I had 20 years ago, I wouldn't have the same chemos. I wouldn't have the same treatments. I think tinnitus is that way. And part of that is because of the funding that was raised, not just from the government, but from nonprofits behind cancers. And I think tinnitus here for Tinnitus Awareness Week, that's what the ATA is trying to do. So we want to take what we've done with you, either having you as a volunteer or as a funder, and try to pay it forward. And so you, both of you sharing all of this information is a big part of that. I would also encourage anyone who's watching, if you're still watching at this point, consider getting involved, whether it's volunteering or making a gift to an organization that's dedicated to the cause. I think that's a great way to look forward and pay it forward. I guess I'd close by asking either of you this question. 5 years from today, where do you hope Auricle and or tinnitus treatment overall will be? What keeps you optimistic about where we're headed?
I think it's Jon's turn to speak.
I'd be happy to answer that question. I think first, though, with regard to your prior question, Patrick, and what the ATA can do, I completely concur with all of the comments that Susan made. But I think what I would add to that is events like today's, where you are interviewing people that are in the space, both as researchers as well as companies, is a great public service, because I think that allows us to speak directly to the many stakeholders that you have. So I think these types of interviews are really purposeful for that. And I think the other thing I would say is that educating your patient stakeholders and informing them about, for example, the medical device development process and what's involved in that and why. Also, talking about good clinical study design and why it's so important that, especially studies, not just in tinnitus, but whether it is anxiety, pain, depression, dizziness, in any area where the placebo effect is so profound, why is it that you need to have good study design? So I think perhaps patient education pieces that help illustrate that might be very helpful. In terms of where I hope that the company will be in 5 years, I certainly hope that we are having product available in two major global markets. I would define that as the US and the European Union, and perhaps a third market in Asia on the cusp of having a system available for patients. And clearly, in all markets, we would love to see really strong traction in terms of patients getting real results and obtaining a great therapeutic outcome from the use of our device. So if we can be there in 5 years, that would be great.
We're all pulling for you, and I certainly selfishly hope you are as a patient, but certainly the organization feels that way as well. The more options we have, the better. And forgive me, because one last question popped into my mind. As I was thinking about sharing my personal story with oncology and cancer, many of the treatments I've had, sometimes they've been one-off, sometimes they've been over many years. Sometimes I'll take medicine depending on the intrusiveness of a symptom. Does a device like yours, is it intended to be long-term consistently, or is it periodic? I'll use it when I'm having issues and then not use it when I'm not.
I can take a stab at that, and then Jon can add stuff to it. So I think currently we don't really know the answer to that, but what we can project from the findings that we have so far is that we've shown with 6 weeks of treatment that we can do a pretty good job, and that we see a progressive and cumulative improvement in the person's loudness and TFI. And now if we went for longer, it could be that the effect lasts even longer. And it could be that at some point, the person's tinnitus is bearable and that it may need just a tuning up, like every weekend or every month or so on. But that is data that has to be collected in real world. And so we know we can project the findings, but we don't know that yet for sure.
Thank you. I'm sorry to get back into the detail there with that question. It popped into my head there at the last minute. But Jon, to your point, the future does sound hopeful. And I guess while I have the audience here, we're excited to announce that this year's round of funding for our research grants is open. So if you're a researcher and you've made it this far into the conversation, and whether you'd like to volunteer on our SAC like Dr. Shore did, or you'd like to apply for a grant like Dr. Shore did, the call for grants is open. So please visit ata.org to check that out. And Jon and Dr. Shore, thank you for all this time and sharing what you can with our community. I don't know if either of you have any other final points or questions or comments, but certainly on behalf of the 50 million people we represent dearly, thank you very much for what you're doing, for the work you've done to date. We're all rooting for you, and whatever we can do to share information, we're here.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for providing us this opportunity to provide important information, which we're both hopeful was useful to your many persons with tinnitus that are tuning in.
I think it was, and I think we've got a lot to look forward to. I don't want to take either more of your time than you already have. You've been so generous. So thank you so much. If you're still watching, ata.org for more information. If you're so moved, please consider making a gift and paying it forward. We cannot give what we do not have. And certainly every dollar we raise is another dollar we can put toward future research, like the research we heard about today. Again, thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.